How do I think about community archives? I think of that what they're doing is addressing archival absences as a first thing, saying something is not being done elsewhere, so we need to do it. The second thing is probably that emphasis on the we. We need to do it.
From the Society of American Archivists student chapter at the University of Alabama, this is Archives and Communities, a podcast highlighting community archiving initiatives and the people behind them.
Gail Reimer founded the Jewish Women's Archive in 1995 and was the director for 18 years. A native of New York City and daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, Gail describes how she recognized the absence of material about the lives of Jewish women and felt the necessity to respond to this archival silence by telling their stories. Gail begins by describing her lifelong interest in telling stories and the interesting career path, ideas, and conversations that led to the creation of the Jewish Women's Archive.
Okay, so I grew up in New York City, the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. One of the things that I was very aware of before I started the archive was how much energy was going into documenting the lives of Holocaust survivors. And in fact, most of the information, or most of the obvious information about Jewish women that was available was of women who had survived. Steven Spielberg was doing an oral history collection. There was a collection at Yale. There are many community collections of Holocaust survivors going on. I realized that the story of Jewish women in America, certainly in the 20th century, was going to end up being the story of survivors, a very important story, but not the only story. So that was one of the stimuli among a host of others that I can mention later. But I think also the other piece of being a child of a survivor of survivors was that I was very aware of what it means to be missing a history. We had nothing from my grandparents or any generations prior to my parents, and we didn't even have anything from their childhoods. We just had, their life as it started again in America, with a few artifacts from the short time they lived in Germany after the war before coming here. So I think I also was very acutely aware of what missing history means and how painful it can be when history is missing, and how you feel, how your own identity is, somehow compromised by those missing pieces. I went to Jewish schools as a child and right through high school. I then went to college just outside of New York City. Also spent a year in Israel studying. And in college, actually before college, I became very interested in literature, the study of literature, and more specifically in narratives. What are the stories that people tell? What are the stories, and how do we make meaning of stories? How do we make sense of the world through those stories? So that became in college a kind of abiding interest. And I think, again, that probably ties back to my parents being survivors and their experience in the war. But my sense that we are really moved and educated by stories. And we need those stories and narratives to identify with in order to situate ourselves, in order to figure out who we are in a lineage and a line as part of a community as well. I went on to pursue those interests in graduate school and received a PhD in English literature, which I would not necessarily recommend as a route for future archivists. I think what happens in graduate school is, or at least what used to happen in graduate school, was there was a narrow path, and that path was you became like your professors and you went on to be a professor, which is what I did. I taught at Wellesley College for 7 years. And while I was there, 2 important things happened. One was the Women's Studies program at Wellesley College began, and I started teaching in that, as well as the English department. And I also spent a sabbatical year at the Bunting Institute at what was then Radcliffe College. The institute is now, I think, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. But at that time, it was housed in a building together with the Schlesinger Library, which is a library dedicated to the social history of women in America. And I became very familiar with that library and worked there and was interested in that library. And that too was part of this strange route that gets me to starting the Jewish Women's Archive. So I taught at Wellesley, but it at a certain point, Wellesley felt like too small a stage for me. And I wanted a larger stage in which to be doing the work that I was doing. And I also was more interested in the public humanities than I was in scholarly research. So I left Wellesley to join the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, which is the state-based arm of the National Endowment for the Humanities. While I was there, I also was involved in co-editing 2 books. The first one was called Reading Ruth, Women Reclaim a Sacred Story. And that was a collection of essays by Jewish women on the Book of Ruth, but Jewish women from all different disciplines, and including artists and poets and novelists, also scholars, psychologists, etc. And then a second book called Beginning Anew, A Woman's Companion to the High Holy Days, which was specifically about the biblical texts that are read on the High Holy Days, also essays by women. It was as we were working, my co-editor, Judith Cates, and I, as we were working on the second book, I just had this moment. It feels, in retrospect at least, as a moment, a flash moment, like what we used to call a click moment, that what we were doing was putting together the little fragments of the stories of women that were found in the texts, because there was very little. And out of those, we were weaving whole stories, we being the writers for this book, weaving whole stories. And it occurred to me that we were busy trying to recreate the stories of ancient Jewish women or ancient women described in the Bible. And in the meantime, we were losing the stories of the women around us, and that somehow retrieving the stories are for Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, etc. But we were neglecting to do the same for our own mothers and grandmothers. And the Jewish narrative would continue to present a very partial and distorted picture, the same kind of partial, distorted picture that we were trying to correct in the Bible would continue historically unless something was done. And I thought we have to do something about this. And starting an archive seemed like a good way to go.
As creator and director of the Jewish Women's Archive, Gail describes the numerous tasks and responsibilities associated with creating a nonprofit organization, as well as the creation of their archival initiative.
So what I did once I had this idea was I just started talking to everybody I could, to archivists that I knew, to historians, to community members, to women involved in women's history, women involved in the women's movement. I just was, I really did a year of what I called strategic conversations. Some weren't that strategic, but many were, just to get a sense and feel for what people thought about this idea, whether they thought it was necessary, et cetera. I think most people got excited about the idea. Many thought it was not, how do you make it happen? Many worried whether it could really be done. And in the course of these conversations, there were 2 critical conversations. One was with an archivist who was, I think, pretty prominent in the field at the time, Helen Samuels. She was the archivist at MIT. And the other was a philanthropist. Well, let me start with Helen Samuels. And Helen really challenged me to think about an archive in a different way. I had really been thinking about the Jewish Women's Archive as a kind of version of the Schlesinger Library, except that this would be about Jewish women and not American Jewish women, largely stated. And Helen really got me to think about how people were beginning to document their lives and also think ahead. I mean, she was at MIT. So that was one of the advantages. Then I was right, I'm living in a city with wonderful institutions, and particularly institutions that are like MIT, that are very forward thinking around technology. And so she also challenged me to think about how people would be accessing information in the future. And it was really through her questions, which also answered a number of challenges that had been raised by other people I had talked to, like, well, my papers are already in this archive, so I want to be in the Jewish Women's Archive, but my papers are there. Or that was one problem that people raised. Another was people who said, actually, it was a friend of mine at MIT, my whole career has been here. I'm going to give my archives to MIT. It's not that I have any problem with being identified as a Jewish woman, but why would I not want my papers among the papers of scientists? So that was another issue. And then there was the geographical issue that papers were dispersed people were across the country. And they said, why would I send why should someone in California or in Tennessee or in Ohio send their papers to Boston, Massachusetts, just because someone has set up a Jewish Women's Archive there? So all of those were problems or challenges that I was trying to address. And then the moment that Helen helped me see another possibility, I thought that addresses all of them. I mean, your papers could stay wherever their natural home is, and they could just be accessible through the Jewish Women's Archive. And so really from very early on, we knew that we were going to be a virtual archive. We still weren't sure whether we would be independent or not, but the virtual piece was there right from the start. And it was the most exciting thing. I mean, it's also important to realize that this was 1995. This was before Google. This was before, the internet was just beginning to be used in the ways that we're using it now. So there were no digital archives. We were really a pioneer in that field. So that was the first person. The second person that was really important was a philanthropist who got very excited by the idea. And that's really what allowed us to begin. Money matters. And she initially funded, but it wasn't much, but it was still something to get started with. I was actually sitting in this room, which looked very different. Now it's my grandchildren's playroom. It used to be my study. I was sitting in this room working on a computer, and that was really the beginning of the Jewish Women's Archive. My responsibilities were to, in the beginning, it was about really setting up an organization more than anything else. Creating a 501c3, then creating a board of directors, then finding a pro bono lawyer who would help us with issues of ownership, any other issues that were relevant to archives, finding other donors. And, so I would say that was my primary job at the beginning, but also I organized a conference that brought together historians. It was a 3-day working conference of historians, archivists, and foundation representatives. It was 3 days at Brown University where we sat together and in small groups thinking about what should we collect. And that was the first document that was created in giving us some kind of plan, though it was much too ambitious. I mean, it was a lot of historians, and historians tend to want everything collected. We knew pretty soon afterwards that we weren't going to, that document was not going to be an actual plan. It was just going to be a kind of guidelines for what to look for, what to look at. I guess the next thing was that it became clear that in order to raise money, to get people excited, to move forward, we needed to do a pilot project that would give us some kind of credibility. And the first pilot project that we engaged in was an oral history project. It was a local oral history project with one of the major synagogues in the Boston area. And we worked with volunteers at the synagogue, interviewing women 80 and older. It was a very successful oral history project. I mean, many of these women had very interesting lives. Good things happened in the connections. And we also did an art piece to that where each artist was given an oral history and created a work of art based on that oral history. And then that became an exhibit that the community was invited to. And so it became a very large community endeavor. Later on, in later years, we actually expanded that project and we did a similar project in Baltimore, which also had an art exhibit attached to it with the entire Baltimore Jewish women's community. And then we did one in Seattle as well. In Seattle, there was an exhibit at the Museum of History and Industry. And I mention that because whereas the earlier exhibits were at a synagogue, at a Jewish community center, and at a Jewish museum, in Seattle, it was at a regular Seattle institution that was not Jewishly connected. So it brought in a whole other audience, which has also been part of the purpose is not just for Jewish women to see themselves, but for others to see Jewish women, and others being other Jews, but also other women, other members, other people that they live in the midst of and live together with. So that brought us into oral history. We got involved in an educational project. And as you can probably hear, all of these projects were done in partnership with other institutions. I was one person. I could not do this by myself. So I found good partners, started also hiring staff. And then we started really working on the virtual archive, and creating a web presence was really the central piece of what we needed to do, but we knew that was not going to be very sexy or wouldn't attract a lot of attention or press, but these pilot projects did. What you can hear is starting any nonprofit, whether it's an archive or a museum or I have a son-in-law who runs a political nonprofit. A lot of it is you go into it because you're really interested in history or whatever the content is. But as executive director, you're responsible for a lot of other things that I didn't really think about that much before I started doing it, which were, and I'm not even talking about management of staff, which also is part of it, but I'm talking about fundraising and board relations and community relations. And I spent a lot of time trying to, doing PR and trying to get us publicity. So that and publicity, not for the sake of publicity. If you want the community involved, you need to publicize yourself.
Gail shares her ideas about community archiving as a way to address archival silences through the sharing of material within communities and making that information accessible to the community.
I was thinking, so the American Jewish Historical Society is a community archive as the American Jewish community, which is hardly a unified community, but they try to represent that broad swath of the Jewish community. There's several Jewish archives, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Jewish Archives. They're pretty negligent on women. They were not interested. And these community archives, start in the late 19th century. So I guess there's already collecting going on then, or the early 20th century. But they're not interested, as I said, in women. So you actually can find some women's papers, but they're usually buried inside the papers of their husbands or some organization that they belong to, and they're very hard to find. Actually, it was true of the Schlesinger Library as well. They had Jewish women in their collection, but they rarely were identified as Jews. They were only identified as Jews if they worked for a Jewish organization or if they did something specifically Jewish. And one of the things the Jewish Women's Archive wanted to do, and we have done, is that they work in the Jewish community, they work outside the Jewish community, they don't work also, and their lives are still interesting, etc. And that was an absence in both Jewish archives and women's archives that we were trying to fill. So I guess to answer the question that you asked, how do I think about community archives? I think of that what they're doing is addressing archival absences as a first thing, saying something is not being done elsewhere, so we need to do it. The second thing is probably that emphasis on the we. We need to do it. So it's owning our own history and saying, we don't want other people telling us what's important in our history. We want to do it ourselves. And we want to decide what about women should be collected, which that conference at Brown University was really designed to do, to gather together women and say, what is it about our history that we think is important and worth collecting? I think the other thing I would say, I'm guessing, but I'm hoping, and it's certainly true of the Jewish Women's Archive, is that community archiving is not just about collecting, but it's about sharing what's collected with the community, making sure that there's access to the materials, and maybe even through sharing, empowering the women who come to the archive or come to the materials or come to whatever is being collected and learn about it. So our mission statement, which I know has been revised recently, but I think it still says more or less the same thing, and with more emphasis on the social change piece of it. But the original mission was to uncover, chronicle, and transmit. And by transmit, we meant, what we intended was that this was not going to be one of those archives that was heavily guarded and that, you had to have special permission to come in and look at anything. But this was going to be a place where access was primary, where we wanted more and more people to be engaged with the materials that we were collecting, and more than collecting, really curating.
Her parting words of advice to anyone interested in this type of work is that you should do it, and a few other pieces of wisdom about representing communities.
It's very important work. It's very rewarding work. Working within one's own community has a special draw to it, not coming as an outsider, but being an insider, though I imagine that being an outsider has its own advantages. Maybe you can see things that other people can't, or that we miss when we're too focused on our own community. One of the things to really think about, and I assume that community archivists do this, is that communities are not static. They're dynamic, they're changing, and they're usually more diverse than we even think. And so it's very easy to have an idea that this is what represents a community. But I think the most enjoyable piece of my work, and also the most productive piece of my work, were the conversations that I had with people. Talk to anybody you think can offer you some knowledge about the community in which you're working, as well as in the activity that you were involved in. Don't be afraid of challenges. I think that that's critical. There are a lot of challenges when you start this work. One of the challenges is, which I hadn't mentioned earlier, but when we would start any project, we feel like, if we do this, we're going to be overwhelmed with information or overwhelmed with things, or too many people will send us stuff. That's not a problem. You can find ways to handle that. I mean, we know that many conventional traditional archives have long delays before they actually process papers. We can do that too in community archives. Not everything has to be available the moment you get it. And in fact, that leads into another thing I guess I would recommend, which is to not only think of yourself as an archivist, but recognize that you're also a curator, and that however you put things forward, you are putting your stamp on them and your way of looking at them. And so first, to recognize that and understand it. But the second thing that I think is very important is to always leave room for other people to comment, suggest other ways of reading the same stories or material. And never feel like if somebody thinks differently about something, that you're wrong. You're not wrong. It's just that there are different ways of looking at the same materials.
That's extremely helpful. Learning about how we collect and how we go about assigning value to things, to consider other perspectives and not just our own perspective of what makes it valuable.
Laura, if I could say one more thing, archivists often, and this relates to what I was saying about curation, that archivists often think of themselves as custodians of history. I like to think of us as makers of history, and also like to suggest to everyone that we serve that they too are makers of history. We're all makers of history. And we should all, we should invite all our users to become makers of history. Part of what I wanted to do and what I see community archiving as being is ownership over one's own history, but we don't personally own it, or everybody owns that history.
I would like to thank Gail for making time to do this interview and for sharing her valuable experience with us. Please visit the Jewish Women's Archive through the link provided below. Until next time, thanks for listening to Archives and Communities.
This was an episode of Archives and Communities, the official podcast of the SAA student chapter at the University of Alabama. Music by Scanglobe and Scott Holmes. Opinions expressed in this podcast are not reflective of any particular institution. Thank you for listening, and join us again next time.